In this video, we're talking about the causes of the American Revolution. This is just a quick overview of some of the main events. It's really a simplistic video about a much more complicated idea that we'll discuss more in class, but these are just some of the basic key points to know. Again, it all started with the Stamp Act, which was the first time the British had taxed the colonies. The tax that had to be affixed on all paper products. And as we talked about, it wasn't just about having to pay the tax. It wasn't about money. This was about rights. This is about representation. And it really all stemmed back to the English Bill of Rights, which stated that no English citizen could be forced to pay a tax unless they had given their consent through Parliament. And since American citizens did not have a representative in Parliament, they felt that they did not have their rights being upheld and should not be forced to pay this tax. And different people displayed their anger in different ways. There was mob violence, tarring and feathering, people being hung up on poles like this poor gentleman here. But fortunately, there was some rational, much more peaceful, and much more effective means of protesting the Stamp Act. And again, the rallying cry, no taxation without representation. And that's really going to be something important all throughout the Revolution to the colonists. You have different signs, even people decorating, teapots with no Stamp Act. The most effective tool for protesting the Stamp Act was the boycott. Boycott is when you refuse to buy goods for a certain reason, and colonial citizens refused to buy goods from British merchants, which put them in a bad position. They weren't making any money, and a lot of them were very influential back in England, and they put political pressure on Parliament to get rid of the Stamp Act. Individuals within the colonies, like Patrick Henry, as you read in class, wrote about the Stamp Act and the injustices of the Stamp Act. Other people like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson also wrote out. So you have a lot of different protests in different ways, and ultimately it was effective. The Stamp Act was repealed a little more than a year after it was passed. This was definitely seen as a victory in the colonies. They had stood up against England, and they had won. Problem is, the English didn't get exactly why the colonists were upset. They felt that this was an issue of money, and this particular tax, the Stamp Act, was unpopular, but other taxes might not be so much. They didn't understand it was a rights thing, it was a representation thing. And here's a political cartoon of the death of the Stamp Act. The British Prime Minister holding the casket of the Stamp Act. So this was something that the colonists definitely saw as a victory, but unfortunately was temporary because, again, the British thought that if they passed different taxes, it'd be okay. Things like the Sugar Act, the Townshend Acts, along with many other ones. And as they passed new acts and new tax laws, the colonists were again upset. And the British, in an attempt to stop colonial uprising and colonial protesting, sent troops over. The irony being is the troops, who are there to be a force to prevent protests, are actually a reason that further agitated protests. The colonists saw the British soldiers as really invaders. They were not welcomed there. The British had never stationed soldiers in the colonies before outside of the French and Indian War. And so they did not like them at all. And unfortunately, in Boston in 1770, it's going to lead to bloodshed. A group of colonials in Boston started harassing a detachment of British troops. The British were essentially surrounded. The colonists were throwing ice balls at them, oyster shells, rocks, and in the chaos and confusion, the British opened fire. 5 colonists were killed. And this was a tragic event, but it was by no means a massacre. However, that is exactly how it was portrayed. This very famous printing by Paul Revere shows the colonial interpretation of what happened. You have the British all lined up in a row, as if they were in formation to fight. their commander is giving the order to fire on the poor, helpless colonists, and that's really not how it happened at all. But if you lived outside of Boston and didn't experience this firsthand, when you looked and saw this print, this was your reality. This is what you thought had actually happened. So the propaganda really made this more than it actually was. And the aftermath was the soldiers were actually arrested and placed on trial for murder. And John Adams, who no one really expected to, was a lawyer, and he rose up to defend the British, saying, if we're going to be about freedom and liberty, this is something that he had to do, that this was a wrongful conviction, and he was able to get them acquitted. But after that, the British realized the error of having troops, and so they're going to remove all troops from the colonies, from Boston, take them back to England. But what this meant was now there was no force protecting British interests anymore. And this is going to really come into play with the Tea Act, passed in 1773. Now, this was not an actual tax. What it was a law requiring the colonists to buy tea from England. And what the colonists had been doing for a while was actually smuggling tea in illegally, which had been illegal before, but no one was really doing anything about it. And if anyone was arrested, they were tried in the colonies, and they got really a slap on the wrist of anything. What this did was it said not only was it to be enforced, no one smuggling in, but if anyone was caught, they weren't tried in the local colonial courts. They were taken all the way to England and tried there, which angered the colonists for the reason that they could no longer buy tea how they wanted to or from whom they wanted to, but also that their sovereignty as a law system was being taken away, that they couldn't try their own criminals in their own courts, and the British were stepping in. So anyone who was arrested had to go to England to be tried by a usually unfavorable British judge who would not give them a fair trial. They also had to go to England, which was an expense in itself. And colonists all over the 13 colonies were angry. Again, in Boston, the most famous single incident happens with the Boston Tea Party, where the first shipment of tea coming in after the Tea Act was passed was boarded by a group called the Sons of Liberty, which is basically a colonial terrorist organization. And crates of tea were thrown overboard to a great financial loss to the English. And for the English, this was really the last straw. They're going to pass a group of laws collectively known as the Intolerable Acts. British called them the Coercive Acts. And this had a large range of effects, and it was solely punishment for Boston. It closed their harbor, which they were a major trading city, so this was a huge economic blow. It dissolved the government of militia. The king appointed a royal governor who could appoint any position that he wanted to. And we had the Quartering Act, which forced Americans to quarter British troops. This was seen by the British as something that would punish the colonists and that would weaken Boston into submission. But actually what it did was it united the colonists together, really, and people from all over the colonies came and they helped Boston to get through this. So it actually further united and had the opposite effect the British wanted to. Now, independence was still something that people weren't quite talking about yet on a large scale. They were angry, very angry with England, but it really wasn't until a pamphlet written by a British immigrant named Thomas Paine called Common Sense that people really started to talk about revolution. He stated quite simply, basically, we're already at war with England, we're already separate, let's make it official. And this was read in bars, this was read in government buildings, in town meetings. People really responded to this common sense, and it's going to begin real discussion over independence.